I got my first head coaching job in 1979. I wasn't even 30 years old. In all honesty, I was not ready in any way whatsoever to be a head football coach. I made a ton of mistakes that I'd never make now. I was way too convinced that I knew what I was doing, and I didn't. I was not only hired as a head football coach, I was also the athletic director, the boys basketball coach, the girls basketball coach, and the baseball coach, along with being a full time teacher. Obviously, no one could do all those jobs well. I certainly couldn't. Now, I'm not saying we didn't have any success. We kind of did. We went to the playoffs in football, the first time that school had ever done so. We had the best basketball seasons they ever had, and we won in baseball. But we could have done a lot better if I had been better prepared for the position I was in. We lost a football game early because the other team was ripping us on a simple isolation play. Now, the old isolation play was like football offense 101. Your fullback was a lead blocker on the other team's linebacker, and your running back followed him up inside and then cut off that block. It was smash mouth football at its finest. Now, you couldn't have a defense that had no chance against isolation in 1979, but we did. I didn't have enough experience on that side of the ball, and it cost us. As I said, we were more successful than they had ever been. We beat some teams they had never beat. One of those was a school I had been an assistant at prior to accepting this coaching job. In fact, they had hired me for this job because I had worn out their JV team for the 2 years I was head JV coach at the other school. The school I coached at before this was our first conference game of the season. It was at their place, and obviously it was a game I really wanted to win. They had been pretty good in the past, playing for a state championship while I was on the staff there. They were seen as the rich school that we played, whereas my current school there was a country school. I'd been on the same staff with their head coach the previous year and had coached pretty much all of their players. It was going to be an emotional game. Moving from one school to the other was a bit of a culture change. We didn't have extras at my new school. When I got there, the grass or weeds or whatever you want to call it on the football field was about knee high. I had to cut it. The watering system was these huge PVC pipes, and you would have to move them every 10 yards once they had watered part of the field. One person could not move them. My in-school staff consisted of one person who was right out of college and whose athletic experience was that he had been a cheerleader. I hired 3 good old boys to be my assistants. When I say hire, I don't mean they got paid. They were volunteers. Now, 2 of them were brothers, and they had coached there in the past. They were old school, tough as nails. They joined the Marines in their youth just so they could go through the experience of Marine boot camp at Paris Island. You can't make that up. All 3 always had a chew of tobacco in their mouths. I was the only member of the staff who didn't chew. My dad chewed, especially when he played baseball. So did most people playing baseball in the 70s. I took it as something you were supposed to do. So in my late teens, I chewed, but only when I played baseball. I don't mean dip or some of that fancy flavored stuff. I mean a plug of Red Man stuck in your jaw. I found I actually liked it. At least I liked it until that game playing shortstop when the batter hit a line shot at me. And as I reached to snare it, the plug went down my throat. I cannot describe the level of sick that came over me. It was gradual and it got worse by the minute. I turned a ghastly shade of green. I was very dizzy. The entire ball field was spinning. I puked up not only everything I had eaten in the past week, but I think I may have brought up at least one internal organ. I never put a chew in my mouth again. I can't say the same for the player who was laid out on the field one night, unable to get up after being tackled. I rushed out, asked him where he was hurt. Nowhere, he moaned. I swallowed my chew. He had a fresh chew when he showed up to practice on Monday. The players were a little different than what I had encountered before. They were tough. Their parents didn't baby them or just give them things. Those kids worked. Many of them worked tobacco in the summer. If you never worked tobacco, it's hard to explain. It's hot. It's sticky. It's nasty. It's really hard work. Part of it entails hanging the tobacco at the top of the barn. The heat is unbearable. We had so many players who worked tobacco that we held our August practices at 8 or 9 p.m. so they could work and then get to practice. Those kids started working at daybreak. They finished at sundown. And then they came to football practice. They were tough, and they were strong, and they were conditioned. No one had to worry about heat acclimation with those kids that worked tobacco. Unfortunately, there were a few who didn't work. We had the one kid who wanted to be in the band at halftime and during pregame, but also wanted to play football, which was a big no from me. During the first day of practice, he fell out while running. Obviously, he hadn't been working outside like the others. I literally thought he was going to die. Now, this was the 70s. We didn't know a lot about heat exhaustion then. Heck, we still gave him salt tablets before practice. We still had very few water breaks. Now, we had progressed beyond when I played, and the coach told us not to drink the water, just swish it around in your mouth and spit it out. Now, I did not try to emulate one of my high school coaches, the great Mooney Player, who, while I was in high school, had read about this new thing at the University of Florida where they were making something for the players at Florida to drink instead of water. The new beverage they were experimenting with at Florida would have electrolytes in a flavored drink. He decided to make his own. He put salt in red Kool-Aid and stirred it up, no sugar. He put this in big wash tubs with ladles, and we were supposed to drink it at practice. Y'all, we had our own version of Don't Drink the Kool-Aid long before Jim Jones. But this player who fell out really scared me. Now, it turned out he wasn't really in any danger. He was exaggerating for attention. I didn't know him well enough to know that at the time, but I should have realized from the lack of concern being shown by the other players. I later found out that he was notorious for attention seeking. And I also learned why the other players often mooed at him when he passed by. As it turned out, he told him he had had sex with a cow. Fortunately, he quickly decided football wasn't for him and moved on. I'm not sure how well it would have gone with a leather football being the primary focus of the game. That conditioning and toughness paid off in the game versus the so called rich kids. Our guys played very well. I got to run one of my special favorite trick plays where we sent most of the team over towards the sidelines and snapped the ball and scored on the other team. We won the game. My current school had never beaten them before, so it was a huge win. As I walked off the field, there were two good old boys hanging out along the fence. In South Carolina, if you're coaching at a country school, you're going to have good old boys hanging along the fence. They don't sit in the stands. They wander the fence. They're usually loud. When one of them yelled out, "Hey, coach, come over here," I was a little bit apprehensive. These were two farmers, rough looking, standing there in their overalls. But I went over, fearing the worst. "That was a really good game," one of them said. He's reaching into the pockets of his overall. He pulled out this really big roll of bills and handed it to me. "Take them boys out for a steak dinner next week, and whatever's left is yours." I was floored. If you look at those two, you'd think they didn't have a pot to piss in. But in fact, they were doing well between their tobacco crop and their other illegal crop, which was the biggest cash crop in the county. We took them out the next week. We fed them steaks. I took the leftover money and bought some football equipment with it. I learned that if you were successful, people would be willing to help the program out financially at a level they wouldn't if you weren't successful. I also learned that it wasn't always the guys in the suits who are going to be your most important boosters. I had another type of booster experience altogether 5 years later when I first went to McBee High School in South Carolina as an assistant coach. We were on the road playing one of the small schools we played then, most of which no longer exist. I can't remember which school. I think it was McCall. A few years later, they combined McCall, Clio, Blenheim, Wallace, and Bennettsville and formed a new school. Whichever school it was, they didn't have a press box large enough for opposing coaches to get in, and the visiting bleachers were very low. So in order to be able to see well, we pulled the activity bus up to the corner of the field and ran the cord for the headsets to it. Yes, we stood on top of the activity bus in the corner just past the bleachers in order to be able to radio down to the field what we could see from our perch high above the playing field. You know, bus high. This was not the first or the last time we would be standing on top of the activity bus rather than on a press box. And yes, you heard me right. We ran a cord. In those days, all the headsets were connected by a cord. You had to make sure you had enough to reach around the field to the press box or to the bus, as the case might be. You also had to have someone behind the coaches on the sideline keeping the cords from getting tangled up. Coach Dennis Farmer, who was the head JV coach and known far and wide as Fox. For some reason, I still don't know. He and I were the two coaches in the press box, or on the bus, as the case might be. And I had a headset. The game was a struggle for us offensively, as many of our games were back then. We repeatedly ran what was called 44 ISO. That's that same isolation play I mentioned earlier, with the fullback lead blocking on the linebacker. Yeah, we ran that over and over and over, despite the fact that we practiced running option all week. Everything went wrong. We fell behind, and we were unable to move the ball at all. One of the parents, who was very generous to the program over the years, and who was a very likable guy, became increasingly upset with what was going on. He had 3 sons who played for us, and they were all pretty good players. And he not only supported the program financially when his sons played, but after they graduated as well. Now, the fact that he had a little too much to drink before and possibly during the game began to weigh on him. Hell, the way it was going, I would have probably joined him to have a few to kill the pain. At any rate, he grew more and more frustrated with the play calling as the game and the alcohol wore on. And he was growing pretty loud. Now, it wasn't hurting my feelings particularly. It wasn't like the head coach was listening to me. And thank God he certainly wasn't listening to the insane assistant coach on the sidelines, the guy wearing cowboy boots and coaching shorts, who kept going over to him, urging him to go to the wishbone, which was a good thing since, unlike the option, we never practiced the wishbone. Finally, this parent had enough. Got out of the stands, pulled out his pocket knife, grabbed the cord to the headsets that was running under the bleachers to the bus, and he cut the cord. Now, one of his pals, been sitting next to him, the voice of the Panthers at our home games, immediately looked at him and said, "Look what you did. You just cut off the only one of them that knows a damn thing." In our next episode, I'm going to tell you about a memorable coach I worked with for many years. I'll introduce you to Coach Russell Bird and his approach to beer on the golf course, his relationship to Cinderella, and his use of my point system. Be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss it.